Alexander the Great is remembered as the man who conquered the world. But conquest alone does not explain him, because Alexander did not behave like a man content with victory. The more he won, the further he seemed to drift from ordinary human limits. He was not only chasing kingdoms, he was chasing glory, destiny, and perhaps the dangerous fantasy of becoming something more than a man. That is why his story still feels larger than life, not because he conquered so much, but because even he could not conquer death. Long before Alexander conquered anything, he was being prepared for a life that would not feel ordinary. He was born the son of Philip II of Macedon, a king of enormous ambition, discipline, and military power. But Alexander inherited more than a throne. He inherited an atmosphere charged with war, royal expectation, and the dangerous idea that he was meant for something greater than other men. His mother, Olympias, was said to be intense, mystical, and deeply convinced of her son's extraordinary destiny. Around Alexander, stories of omens, prophecy, and divine favor were never far away. And whether those stories were true is almost beside the point, because when a child grows up surrounded by symbols of destiny, he may stop seeing himself as bound by ordinary limits. Alexander was taught by Aristotle. He was trained to fight from an early age. He was raised in a court where ambition was normal, ruthlessness was useful, and greatness was expected. So by the time he entered history, the deeper pattern was already set. Alexander did not simply want success. He had been shaped to believe that he was meant for something larger than life itself. When Philip was assassinated, Alexander inherited not a peaceful kingdom, but a fragile moment. He was young, unproven, and surrounded by men who had every reason to doubt him. Many expected the empire to fracture. Instead, Alexander moved before doubt could harden into resistance. He secured his rule, he crushed rebellion, and he showed, almost at once, that youth would not make him smaller than his father. Then came Persia, and once that war began, Alexander did not move like an ordinary king. Battle after battle, city after city, he kept winning. And with every victory, the line between ambition and destiny grew thinner. Because success at that scale does not merely strengthen a man, it changes the way he sees himself. Around Alexander, the impossible began to feel normal. Empires that should have taken generations to break were falling before a man still in his 20s. And when reality keeps bending in your favor, it becomes easier to believe that you are meant for more than ordinary human limits. Victory did not simply expand Alexander's empire, it began to change Alexander himself. The more he conquered, the less he seemed content to remain just another king. He had entered the lands of Persia, but he did not only take their cities, he also absorbed something of their vision of power. In the Persian world, the ruler was not merely a military leader. He stood above ordinary men, surrounded by ceremony, distance, and almost sacred authority. And Alexander, whether by strategy, ambition, or genuine belief, began to move in that direction. He adopted foreign customs. He demanded gestures of submission that many of his own Macedonians deeply resented. To them, this was not simply politics. It felt like transformation. The man they had followed into battle was beginning to look less like their king, and more like someone reaching for a higher kind of status. Something beyond loyalty, beyond kingship, almost beyond humanity. And this is where Alexander becomes difficult to separate from his own myth. Because power, when it keeps confirming your will, can begin to feel like proof. Proof that you are chosen. Proof that ordinary rules no longer apply to you. And once a man begins to believe that, he is no longer merely chasing victory, he is chasing elevation. By now, Alexander had achieved more than most rulers could imagine in a lifetime. But success did not slow him down. It made stopping even harder. Because once a man begins to believe that the world keeps opening before him, every horizon starts to feel like a challenge. Every distance becomes an invitation, and every limit begins to look temporary. Alexander kept moving east, across mountains, across deserts, across rivers, deeper into lands that felt less familiar to his men and more symbolic to him. This was no longer just a war of conquest. It was becoming something closer to pursuit, a pursuit of the edge of the known world, the edge of glory, the edge of what a single human life could contain. And that is what makes this phase of his story so unsettling, because it raises a difficult question. Was Alexander still chasing victory? Or was he chasing the feeling that there must always be something beyond the next horizon? For the men marching behind him, the campaign was becoming heavier, longer, and harder to justify. But for Alexander, distance itself may have become intoxicating. The farther he went, the harder it became to imagine turning back. Because turning back would mean accepting a boundary. And men like Alexander are remembered precisely because boundaries felt unbearable to them. Every great conqueror eventually meets a limit that cannot be cut down with a sword. For Alexander, that limit was not Persia. It was exhaustion. By the time he pushed farther east, his army had already given him years of marching, blood, victory, and obedience. They had followed him across the edges of the known world, but even the most loyal army remains made of human bodies, human nerves, human fear, human longing, and those things do not disappear just because a king dreams bigger than other men. So when Alexander wanted to go farther, his soldiers stopped. That refusal was more than a pause in the campaign. It was the first time reality openly resisted his vision. Because Alexander could imagine a world without boundaries, his men could not live inside that imagination forever. They wanted rest. They wanted survival. They wanted home. And in that tension between one man's limitless ambition and thousands of mortal bodies, the campaign began to break. For perhaps the first time in years, Alexander could not move the world forward simply because he willed it. And then, suddenly, it was over. After years of marching, victory, ambition, and near-mythic momentum, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. He was still young, still powerful, still surrounded by the image of greatness, and yet none of that could protect him from the simplest truth of all. He was mortal. The exact cause of his death remains uncertain, but in a way, that uncertainty almost deepens the moment. Because history remembers a man who seemed too large for ordinary limits, and then watches him disappear in the same fragile way as every other human being. No final conquest, no last horizon, no victory over time. Just a body failing where a legend once stood, and that is the cruel symmetry of his life. Alexander conquered so much so quickly that he began to seem almost beyond nature. But death has a way of restoring proportion. In the end, even he could not remain. After Alexander died, his empire began to break apart. It had been held together by the force of his will, and that was never going to last forever. Maybe that is the real ending. He conquered the world, but not time. He rose above ordinary men, but never escaped being one. That is why his story endures. Not as proof that a man can become a god, but as proof that even the greatest ambition still ends in mortality.